And welcome to another treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Confident Love. And it's for November the 15th, 2020, Fall Quarter, lesson number 11. And it's taken from 1 John, the 3rd chapter, verses 11 through 24. Now, a little background information. First off, as I said, giving the verses this is taken from 1 John. Now, as far as the authenticity of this epistle and the authorship of this epistle, without question, it was written by the Apostle John. There are numerous early writers of the church who quoted from 1 John and attributed it to the Apostle John. Origen did, Irenaeus did, among many others who quoted from this book. So, without a doubt, this was written by the Apostle John. And also, too, we want to make note that John, after the death of Paul in about AD 64, John took up pastoring in Ephesus for a good many of years. And a lot of Bible scholars believe that that is who John is writing 1 John to the church at Ephesus that he had pastored for such great amount of time. This epistle probably was not written during his exile on the island of Patmos, but it was more than likely written before that time. And today's lesson is dealing with, without a doubt, the most important thing, the most important character of Christian living, and that is displaying love. John 3:11, "For this is the message you have heard from the beginning. We should love one another." Now, earlier in the epistle, John said in 1 John 2:7, "Beloved, I'm writing no new commandment, but an old commandment that you had from the beginning. The old commandment is the word you have heard." 1 Peter 3:8, "Finally, all of you have unity of mind, sympathy, brotherly love, a tender heart, and a humble mind." Love should be paramount in the way that we interact with people, with the way that we deal with people, how we view the world. It should be tempered by the love of God. The love of God should flow through us. We should be demonstrating it daily in the way that we interact with people. Okay? 1 John 3:12, "Do not be like Cain, who belonged to the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own actions were evil and his brothers were righteous." Now, remembering back to that early section of the book of Genesis and the story of Cain and Abel, we note that Cain offered an offering of produce, and Abel offered a animal sacrifice. And God had respect unto Abel's offering, but not Cain. Now, it's interesting for us to stop and think. There are times, there are references in the Old Testament where a grain offering, a wave offering, was accepted by God for that particular time and in that particular ceremony. But this particular time, Cain's offering of produce was not accepted, yet Abel's was accepted. So it leads me to believe that this was a sin offering. And we know that is a sin offering, that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. And a sin offering requires, in that time period, an animal sacrifice. That without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins. So when Cain offered produce, there was no blood in that produce, so his offering was not accepted. And I also want us to contemplate that in the history of the human race, this is the first instance of religious persecution. And notice how that it is motivated by jealousy and being concerned that the other person is more righteous than you are. And oftentimes, that is one of the motivating things that causes people to behave in a very persecution, self-righteous kind of way. When you have one religious group that attacks another religious group, oftentimes it's out of that jealousy. I don't want to make sure that everyone knows that I am more righteous than you, so I'm going to cause you to suffer. And we should never behave in that manner, regardless who they are, regardless who they pray to. We should not persecute another religious group. We should not murder members of another religious group. We should not do violence to members of another religious group. And we see all through the history of mankind where people who claimed allegiance to Jesus were either being persecuted or they were the ones doing the persecution. Now, we need to be prepared to suffer some persecution in this world. But under no circumstances should we be the one doing the persecution. The Bible strictly prohibits that. In this initial story of Cain and Abel actually speaks to that. Don't be like Cain and out of jealous and a hateful heart do violence to anyone for their spiritual walk, how they worship, or what have you. Okay. 1 John 3:13 through 15. Do not be surprised, my brothers and sisters, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love each other. Anyone who does not love remains in death. Anyone who hates a brother or sister is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life residing in him. Now, these are some very blunt and plain language coming out of the Apostle John. We note here that he says, don't be surprised if the world hates you. Now, who's the world? That Greek word cosmos is the word for the entire world system. That includes the culture, that includes the government, that includes the educational system. All of it is tainted with evil. That's one of the reasons why we have to be so careful not to bring any of that into the house of God. We need to be very careful not to equate our cultural preferences as part of the Christian religion, of part of the work of God. In other words, for example, our taste in music. The taste in music is part of that cultural system. And we don't want to make that part of the dogma of the church, that music should sound a certain way to be spiritual. We do not, under no circumstances, ever, under any circumstances, want to bring politics into the house of God. Politics is intricately part of that cosmos system. In it, we are prohibited from bringing the world into the church. Now, I know that there's been a lot of people who have done that over the years, both on the left and on the right within the United States. But it is very clear that when you read the Word of God and take it seriously and look at the examples of the apostles and the disciples in the New Testament, you will not find one instance of them trying to make political change in the world around them inside the church. And neither should we. The gospel is preached to individuals getting saved. Now, you get a bunch of people saved, and the world, your community is going to change because of that. But that is the only way that revival changes a community. True revival changes a community is when a bunch of people get saved and they quit doing the ungodly things that they were doing. Okay? Now, the other thing that we need to stop and focus in on is where John says, anyone who does not love remains in death. Now, there are two types of death that are referred to. Actually, three types of death that are referred to in the Bible. There's the second death, which is ultimately people's ultimate reward by not accepting Jesus. They end up getting cast into hellfire, and that's the second death. There is also the physical death that all of us, unless we're here at the time of the rapture, are going to experience, where you breathe your last breath and you cease to walk around on the face of this planet. And that is the natural death. There is also another death, which is the spiritual death inside of us, where our spirit is dead. And that's the kind of death John is talking about here. James 1:15, then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. In sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. James is talking about that same kind of death. That alienation from God. That is the death that God was warning Adam and Eve about. The day that you'll eat of it, you shall die. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The day that you eat of it. They lived many days past that, in the natural, past that point. But when they ate the forbidden fruit, they spiritually died. Okay? Now, John 3:16 through 18. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. If anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. Let me tell you something. Talk is cheap. If there's one thing that my dad that raised me taught me, that I have cherished and carried with me my entire life, is talk is cheap. Actions are all that matters. And that's in the Christian life, that's the way that is. You can sit there and say, well, God bless you. I'm praying for you. And if you have means to help somebody and you don't do it, there's nothing to you. We have to put legs on our prayers. You hear me? We have got to follow through and be people of action. Okay? Now, James 2:25 through 17. If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to him, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. You got to put legs on your prayers. Now, 1 John 3:19 through 20. This is how we know that we belong to the truth and how we set our hearts at rest in His presence. If our hearts condemn us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and He knows everything. Now, in a lot of verses, and I think this is one of these places where there's double meaning in this. The first meaning is that they are sometimes you will be forgiven for things, you've repented, you've changed, and you have these pangs of guilt that crop up on you from time to time. And I think on one level, this verse is talking to that. And it's saying that if you've been forgiven, let go of it. And there's a lot of truth to that. There's also another level that I believe that verse is talking about. That if you think that if you're feeling a little bit of pang of guilt about something that you've been doing, and it's wrong, and it's sinful, and you're feeling a little bit of pang of guilt, beware, because God's greater than your heart, and you think you're under condemnation just from that little pang of guilt you're feeling for carrying on like that. If you think it's bad now, wait till you stand before the judgment seat of Christ and you're judged there. And you're going to really be in a lot of trouble then. And I believe it's also speaking to that. Okay? Now, 1 John 3:21 and 22. Dear friends, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have confidence before God and receive from Him anything we ask, because we keep His commands and do what pleases Him. I still to this day remember what it felt like to get up off of that altar after I made things right with God. And that clean feeling that was just all over my soul. I mean, it was such joy. And if you're out there and things are not right between you and God, let me encourage you to make things right with God. And that burden will just roll off. Okay? 1 John 3:23 through 24. Now this is His command, to believe in the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, and to love one another as He commanded us. The one who keeps God's commands lives in Him and He in them. And this is how we know that He lives in us. We know it by the Spirit He gave us. Jesus said in John 6:29, Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in Him whom He sent." That is the work of God. And it's by believing in Jesus and letting His love flow through us is the essential part of the Christian life. Now, friends, concluding thoughts, I just want to encourage you to get rid of all the anger, get rid of all the hate, let go of everything, and pray for God to just fill your heart with His love. Friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.